When you start building robots that do many things, you're definitely going to want to know about reusable workflows. Creating reusable workflows allows us to deconstruct one large robot into smaller moving parts. Thinking ahead and breaking our robots down into smaller pieces will allow us to reduce complexity. It also allows us to avoid repeating the same steps many times over and over again in the same robot. The reason why repeating the same steps over and over again can be a bad thing is that if it turns out that one or two of the steps of a collection of steps needs to be updated, then you've got to perform those updates in every group of repeated steps within the robot. The better approach would be to create that set of steps one time and then find a way to reuse that container of steps over and over again, so that way you could change the steps in the container and it would get updated in all the places that we used it. If you've taken my tech primer course, you've seen the small demos I've done of functions or methods in programming. And reusable workflows are very similar to functions or methods in programming. Ultimately, reusable workflows are a collection of activities that can be used over and over again within a larger process. And like I mentioned before, if you change that collection of activities, every place in your larger process where it's used will take advantage of that update without you having to go and change all of the repeating steps. Much like a function call or a method call in programming, we'll be able to pass data into and out of any given instance of a reusable workflow. And this is very similar to the concept of arguments and return statements in programming. The key to all this is the invoke workflow activity. This is going to allow us to open a new project and create and save a workflow that does some smaller portion of our overall process, and then create a different project that uses the smaller process we created in the first project. Let's dive into a simple example so you can see how it works. To demonstrate creating a reusable workflow, I'm going to create two different projects. The first project will be the workflow we're going to reuse, and then the second project will simulate a robot that's reusing the reusable workflow. So to create the reusable workflow, I'll start the usual way by clicking on the blank New Empty Project. I'm saving it to my C Development UiPath directory. And for simplicity's sake, I'll just call this Reusable. Click on Create. Double-click to close my ribbon. This will be an extremely simple project, so I'll jump into Activities, look for a sequence, and click and drag that onto my canvas. And I'll just rename this Reusable Workflow. I'm going to grab a log message and drag that in first. And to make it obvious, I'll use some equal signs here and say reusable started. A few more equal signs. And then Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, and say reusable stopped. And in between there, I'll grab a message box, open my double quotes, and put in a string that says, "You reused me." So when I run this robot, all it's going to do is pop up a message box that says, "You reused me." And if we open the output down here, you can see it says reusable started, reusable stopped. So now let's use the start menu to create another blank project. And this one is going to be called Reuser, which means it's the robot that's going to reuse our reusable workflow. Click Create. And again, to keep this very simple, I'll just grab a sequence, drag that on the canvas. We'll do the same kind of log message where we say Reuser started, Control-C, Control-V, and Reuser stopped. So this robot is not reusing anything yet, and of course if I run it, we're not going to see anything happen. But if I look at the output, we see Reuser started, Reuser stopped. So now let's use the reusable workflow. The way we do that is by going into Activities and grabbing an Invoke Workflow activity. And that's going to be down here under Workflow Invoke. You can see we have a few other options that I'll cover in different videos. We could invoke code, which means we'll synchronously invoke some VB.NET code. Or we can invoke a workflow file, which says that we will synchronously invoke a specified workflow, optionally passing it a list of input arguments. That's the one we want. I'll click and drag it between these two log messages. So you can see right off the bat, it's complaining about something. So when you hover over this, it says value for a required activity argument, workflow file name was not supplied. So that's this right here. We need to supply a file name for the workflow we want to reuse. And the easiest way to do that is simply by clicking on this icon with 3 dots and then navigating to where it lives. Right now we're in development UiPath Reuser. We need to jump up 1 level to UiPath, go into Reusable, and select main.xaml and click open. And it's as simple as that to reuse a workflow. You may remember that when we ran this robot, all we saw was reuser started and reuser stopped. Let's run it again and see what happens. Notice we see the dialog, you reused me. Click OK, and down here in the output, now we see reuser started, then reusable started and reusable stopped, then reuser stopped. So what that means is a robot started and then immediately went into the reusable workflow and then exited from that reusable workflow and finished the robot. Pretty simple, right? So hopefully you can see how this immediately opens up opportunities for you to break down a large, complex workflow into smaller workflows that can be created and tested separately, and then assemble them all together with conditionals and error handling using the invoke workflow activity. In the next lecture, we'll talk about how to supply input data to our reusable workflows. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about how to supply input data from your robot into a reusable workflow. So to do that, I'll go back to my Start menu, and I'll open up my reusable workflow, and notice in our message box, we're simply displaying a literal string here. Let's see if we can make that dynamic by passing something from the main robot into the workflow file. The way we do this is by using this Arguments menu down here at the bottom of the screen. When we click on this, you'll see that it's similar to the Variables window, and one thing I'll mention while we're here on the Variables tab is that variables allow us to share data between activities within a robot, whereas arguments allow us to share data between a robot and different reusable workflows. That's an important distinction. So much in the same way that we could create a variable, we can click here to create an argument. It automatically highlights the name so you can change it. So here I'll type in my objective, which is simply a representation of what is this reusable workflow supposed to do. Obviously, you can name this variable whatever you want. It could be a first name or a last name, or it could be a path to a file. Whatever it is that your reusable workflow needs to do, you can pass in data for it. We've got the ability to make this an inbound argument, an outbound argument, both in and out, or a property. And we'll cover these in future videos. For now, we'll leave it as in. As usual, we've got a variety of argument types. For now, I'll leave it as a string. And if we want to, we could supply a default value. And this will be used in a case where the robot doesn't provide any value for this argument. So here I'll open my quotes and say, I don't know what to do. Because if the robot doesn't tell the reusable workflow what to do, the robot will report this by default. So right now, our reusable workflow has this argument, which is essentially a variable inside the reusable workflow. And what we'll be able to do here is select this literal string and type out the name of that argument. And I'll just hit tab to select it because the autocomplete is showing it to me. It's already a string, so I don't need to use .toString. So when I run this reusable workflow right now, it's going to tell me I don't know what to do. So I'll click OK, and the reusable workflow is done. Again, in output, we just see reusable started and stopped. So let's go open up our Reuser project and see what happens when we simply run this robot with the existing setup. I click on Run, and we see I don't know what to do, which is expected because the robot didn't pass any input data along with this invoke workflow activity. So how do we get the data in? Very simple. We click on this Import Arguments button, and what do you know? It shows the my objective argument here inside the robot. And it's telling us it's an input value of type string, and it's allowing us to type a value to send from the robot to the reusable workflow. I don't have to enter anything right now if I don't want to. I can just click OK. Now, anytime we want to change the value that we send along, we can use Edit Arguments. And you can see Edit Arguments looks pretty much the same. Providing a value for this objective is very easy. Simply click in here, open up some quotes, and type in whatever string you want. Do my bidding. Okay? So I click OK. And this time when I run the robot, we see do my bidding, because the robot passed a string through the argument to the reusable workflow, and the reusable workflow displayed that in the message box. Down here in the output, we see exactly what we would expect. Reuser started, then we see the reusable messages, and reuser stopped. So it's that simple to pass input data from a robot to a reusable workflow file. Now it should go without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Of course, you can create multiple arguments in your reusable workflow. And in that case, when you click on Edit Arguments, you would see multiple arguments in here, and you could supply values for each one. They could be of type string or integer or decimal or whatever you want. For those of you who really know what you're doing, you could even create a custom class using C# or VB.NET and import that into your robot and reusable workflow, and then you'd be able to select that object type in here and pass in multiple values at once using one single class. That's obviously an advanced topic, and I'll show that in future videos. But for now, congratulations. We've successfully invoked a reusable workflow and passed in some input data to it. In the previous video, we talked about how to pass information from the robot into a reusable workflow file. Now let's take a look at going back the other direction. In this case, we'll be creating an output argument. So to do that, I'll go back to my Start menu and open my Reusable project again, and we'll jump straight down to our Arguments menu, and we'll click to create a new argument. In this case, I'll just say reply from reusable, and of course I'm going to change this to an out. We'll leave it as string, and here for the value, it says default value not supported. So we're always going to have to supply a value to this output argument from somewhere inside our reusable workflow. So I'm going to close up my arguments pane, and to facilitate this, after this message box, I'll go into my activities and type in input, and notice I have this input dialog. So I'm going to click and drag this after this message box, and I'll open my quotes inside title here and type the reply. And all that is just a title for what's going to show up on that dialog box. Now this label is going to prompt me for the kind of data that I need to input. So I'll just open my quotes and say type a reply to the robot, :space. So this input dialog is allowing us to type some data in that we're going to send back to the robot that's calling the reusable workflow. What I need to do then is capture that information that we typed over here in the properties pane down in the result. What we would normally do here is right-click and create a new variable. But in this case, we've already got this argument reply from reusable, which is a string. So I'm not going to create a new variable here. I'm just going to start typing reply, and you can see the IntelliSense is showing me my output argument. So I hit tab and click away. So now whatever I type in this input dialog is going to go into my output argument. So that's it for the reusable workflow. Let's hit Ctrl+S to save and open up the robot. So back into Start, click on Reuser, and the first thing I'll do inside this robot that's calling the reusable workflow file is to click on Invoke Workflow and Import Arguments. Now we can see our output argument is right here. And what's interesting is, even though it says enter a VB expression, what it's really expecting us to do is to create a variable here that's going to receive the data that's present inside this output argument. So I'm going to right click in here and say create variable. And I could use the same variable name as we used in the reusable workflow, because they are two separate workflows and two separate scopes. But just so you don't get confused, I'll use a completely different name here. What the workflow replied. It's a stupid long name, but that's fine. I'll click on OK. So now down here in my variables tab, I've got this variable, what the workflow replied. It's a string with a scope of sequence, which is the whole container encapsulating my flow. Close up the variables. And now the final thing we need to do is display that data that's coming back. So to do that, I'll jump into activities, type in message box, and click and drag a message box after my invoke workflow. And I'll click in there and open my quotes and say the workflow says :space, and here I'll use a plus, and I'll start typing that variable we created, what, and I'll hit tab to pick from the autocomplete, and that's it. What we've done here, if we look back inside edit arguments, is we've used this input argument to send data over to the reusable workflow, and this is what we'll see in the reusable workflows dialog. And then the reusable workflow is sending us information back in this output argument, and we're capturing it in this local variable, which we will then display in our own message box. So let's run it and see what happens. So the reusable workflow is displaying our input of do my bidding, and when I click on OK, it presents me with the input dialog box, and I can type in whatever I want here. I don't have to use quotes. I'll just type in this is my reply and hit OK. And now the robot captures that output and says, the workflow says this is my reply. Click on OK and we're done. So it's that simple to get data into and out of a reusable workflow using the invoke workflow activity. And like I said in the previous lecture, you can absolutely use multiple inputs and multiple outputs, whatever your process needs. Instead of creating a reusable workflow in a separate project, it's entirely possible to extract a reusable workflow from inside the current project you're working on. To demo that, I'll create a new blank robot. I'll name it Extractable. Paste that into the description here. Click on Create. And again, like usual, we'll make a very simple robot. So I'll start with a sequence. Click and drag that in. And I'm going to use log messages to demo this concept. So I'll click and drag that in, open some quotes, and say robot step 1. And I'll Control C and Control V that a few times to paste some in. In this case, I'll call this reusable step 1, reusable step 2, and reusable step 3. And I'll name this one robot step 2. So when I run the robot, we don't see anything. But down here in the output, you can see we've got robot step 1, then 3 reusable steps, and robot step 2. People who don't know that much about programming, if they had to do something over and over again, they might actually copy and paste these reusable things again into their sequence. And then maybe we have robot step 3 after that. So of course now when I run this, we see robot step 1, 3 reusable steps, robot step 2, 3 reusable steps, and robot step 3. So it's never a good thing to repeat yourself over and over again, because if for some reason this reusable step 2 needed to change, you would need to go to every instance of step 2 and make that update. And of course, if you reused the same step many times in your robot, that's just more work you have to do to keep things updated. So what we can do to mitigate this problem is to grab a sequence and drag and drop it in front of the first reusable step, then Control select all of those and drag and drop them into my sequence. And I'll just click to rename this reusable steps. So now that those 3 reusable steps are inside of a sequence, I can right click on that sequence header and select extract as workflow. And when I click on that, it's asking me what name I'd like to put on that. And I'll just call it my reusable steps. And notice it's automatically saving it inside the current robot path. But you can click here to change that if you want to put it into a centralized place where other robots can use it as well. For now, I'll just leave it inside my robot and click Create. So now you can see that UiPath created a second file called myreusableSteps.xaml and has included that sequence inside of it. If you go into your project now, you see you have 2 files. This is your original robot file, and there's the workflow you extracted. We've got our 3 reusable steps, and if you go back to the main, you can see what UiPath did is it automatically put in an invoke workflow file activity, and it's pointing at that new file we created. Of course, there are no arguments because we didn't have any input or output data requirements, but if there were variables in those activities, they would automatically have been created as arguments as well. So what I can do now is Control C to copy this invoke workflow, and then jump down here control click these three things and hit the delete button, and then click in here between robot steps 2 and 3 and hit Control V to paste in what we copied from above. So now you can see that that same set of reusable steps can easily be copied and pasted using this invoke workflow activity. So now when we run the robot again, we see very similar output where we've got robot step 1, there's our 3 reusable steps, then robot step 2 and the 3 reusable steps, and robot step 3. So you can see that we didn't change the way the robot works, but what this gives us is now the ability to jump into our project, double click on this reusable workflow, and if step 2 needs to change, I can simply make that update once and be sure to close up this reusable workflow file and put the focus back on main, then run the robot, click on our output, and now you'll notice that both of these step 2s reflect the change I made, even though I only made that change one time. So hopefully you can see the value of using reusable workflows for several steps that might appear more than once in a given robot. Because when you do go and change and save that file, any place where that reusable workflow is used is going to get those updates.